this tape. We're interested in questions and responses.
So first, if you just click this onto your...
Do you want to put it?
Because we're going to swap, how do we do that?
Should we just put it here?
You're going one at a time,
yeah.
or is it?
Yeah, we're going forth and back.
Forth and back.
Well, I think
I don't know if you just...
Marianne, if you just square it, or Mary, the two speakers, so
should we leave it here?
in the middle on the table.
Yeah.
Mary will help you.
She know what she's doing.
I don't want to cause complications for you at all. Just don't worry too much, okay?
But
If we put it here?
Yeah.
Is that?
Yeah.
Super.
Great.
Great.
Yeah. So initially we thought we'd introduce ourselves, so maybe we'll build a bit on what Malcolm has already said. So, should we do? Or would you like to say something?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation.
Yes.
It's been a real challenge because of course we come from a very different background than some of the other speakers. So we come from practice, and so we're also going to try to approach this from a perspective of practice, where we will show some projects, but we will also try to connect to some of the theories that have been discussed in this seminar.
Yeah. So, as Malcolm mentioned, I've been doing these projects in my house, which is how we initially met, because Marianne was running this project at the AA, and I sent them some images of my house project, which we'll discuss in a bit. So, I've been doing these projects since 2001, and this is one of the earlier projects. So, I'll just read a bit I've written about it. So, on several occasions, I've inserted walkways into my own densely inhabited house. These functions as extended white plinths, part thoroughfare, part sculptural system, an element of the gallery displacing parts of the house. The platform has created walkways for visitors, raising them above the occupants, framing objects, people of the house and its collection. Here unusual proximities were created, manipulating the comparative levels of display of the museum-style contents. So often people came round the house and they would particularly decide that it looked a bit like the Pitt Rivers. That was the museum that mainly came up in discussion. The plinths prompted occupants and visitors to discuss and negotiate their relative status within the still functioning domestic spaces, bringing into play conflicting and contradictory power relations which were acted out at a one-to-one scale. My most recent installation, Forced Entry, which I did in 2017, was the fifth in this series since 2001. What's one of the fascinating things about my house, well, I think this is fascinating, it's a former cemetery lodge, and it was built in 1857. And the architect, Philip Hardwick, is the son of Thomas Hardwick, who was the first architect to be employed by William Williams on the design of the Milbank Prison, which we'll come to in a bit. So the social concerns of this house project have shifted between the relative values of order and disorder, which is one of my initial interests, and then the status of the visitors and the inhabitants. And in the latest architectural intervention, I will flick through it in a minute and show you these. It was called Forced Entry, which I did in 2017, and which I made much more intrusive platforms, and that they came in through the windows. So I started being interested in this idea of countering something from a greater distance, really, the bigger distance between the visitors and the people who lived in the house. And this also became there became an element of mapping out the space. So maybe we'll just flick through these. So with this earlier installation, still live, what I was doing is the platform went round the objects and it maintained its level. So as you came into the house, it went right through the house, it maintained its level, and as you got through the house, it relatively got higher and higher. And so here you can see all these wiggles it's doing. It's to accommodate the fridge and the dishwasher and this sort of thing. And so this was collecting time. This was a later installation. For this one, I raised the platform around the side of the rooms because in the earlier installation, people felt like they wanted to be higher in relationship to the visitors, to the inhabitants. So we worked it out, and they decided they wanted to be about 21 inches, and that gave them a feeling that they were equal to the inhabitants in the house. And for this one, I had a hole in the ceiling, and people put their head through the hole, and I collected their heads, but I particularly collected curators' heads. So the idea was, as you walked in, you'd see this body fixed out, coming below this hole. And then I did some other projects, but this was the most recent one. And this one, I took the windows out of the house. And so the idea was you came in from the outside, and as you came in, you then were at a much higher level. So this one I called forced entry, for obvious, so playing with that idea of intrusion.
So my name is Marianne Mueller, and you just heard, I'm on the one hand a practicing architect, on the other hand an academic, and I've been kind of juggling between these two worlds for a long time now. With the practice, we're quite interested in working with the arts. We have completed a number of gallery projects, of which you might know the White Cube in Bermondsey. This was a conversion of a warehouse into an art gallery complex with a series of galleries for White Cube in 2010. Which is still going. You will see it only for a few more years, because then the lease runs out and it might actually change. So on the one hand, we're working with the arts and the idea of display and display in various contexts, in the context of exhibition design or gallery design. And in terms of my teaching, I'm rooted in the Art Academy since last year, actually, which I think is a fantastic opportunity to work in a cross-disciplinary way. This is the White Cube from the inside. So that's one interest that I have. The other interest is really this, how I got to know Fran Cottell, is an interest in what I call concrete geometries, and in how far spatial form actually has an impact on how we engage in a space, and how far spatial form and social practice are very strongly related. This was a research cluster I started at the Architectural Association in 2009. It ran for 2 years. It was an interdisciplinary initiative where we brought together people from art, architecture, and the humanities to look into this idea how spatial form would actually have an impact onto the social activities that would unfold in a space. And so I've been saying the fact that spaces, their form, scale, and figuration affects how people behave in them socially seems an obvious fact to state, especially by an architect. But surprisingly, there's been very little discussion in architecture around that fact. On the one hand, still rooted in sort of, I would say, determinism, the idea that spatial form really dictates how we behave in them, which we don't believe. And on the other hand, very little interest in the recent years in a phenomena that would link it to social space. So this initiative at the Architectural Association brought us in touch. I made an open call. Fran replied with one of her projects, and I was thinking this is exactly what we were looking for. So since then we've been collaborating on a number of projects, and the first one of this was at the Architectural Association.
So we had a conference for this concrete geometries, and the people at the conference, we had to put up an exhibition, and because they saw the walkways running through this space in my house, they thought that might be an interesting way of connecting up this exhibition. But obviously in the house we have to negotiate, you had specific objects that you negotiate that determine the route of and the way the platform's configured. And so it took us. So for this project, we ended up using the ceiling as a found object, and so we used the patterns on the ceiling, and we made that work as to form our structure around this. So I'm just going to read a little bit about it, and then we can talk a bit more about it. So we developed this project in this. This is the front members' room. So this is a former ballroom in the heart of the architecture school. One of the interesting things about it was this chandelier was one of the most expensive things in the building, but nobody ever seemed to focus much on the chandelier. So somehow we were bringing this into this structure. So the focus moved from the relationship between the visitors and inhabitants, like in the house, to a moving and static participations, occupations and activities. The platform both blocked the space and opened it up for new social uses. It took its levels, patterns and configuration from different sets of elements and activities. The site, the architecture of a period room with its own features and formal decorations, and its possible use. The possible uses being the display and dissemination of work through viewing, talking, circulating, meeting and debate as an everyday social space.
So one of the things that I, as a curator of this, was really interested in was in how far we could somehow, by intervening in the exhibition space, create a very different social environment. And the idea was that this platform would moderate this social environment that the format of the exhibition would normally set out. And so what happened is that the exhibition space suddenly became an everyday social space, and it also became a space of conversation, which ranged from formal seminars to informal debates to other forms of conversations. And the spatial division of this platform caused groups to assemble. It created a sense of ownership, and people were starting to interpret these steps, which were somehow too high to be a step and too low to be a seat, and to instigate new sort of uses of this space.
Another very an interesting thing we discovered from doing this project was adjacent to this space, there's this bar. You can see a little bit of it through here, and if you sit in the bar, you're in a normal situation where you can't see everybody. But in this space, because of the way it was structured, you could see everybody all the time. So there was sort of total visibility, and so which we thought was very interesting. And in a sense, there was no hierarchy.
So the exhibition space suddenly had become a very informal social space for the duration of the display. So the next project we worked on, or have been working on since, so it started in 2015 when we suddenly heard about...
Well, we were doing some talks in Sweden. We'd been asked to go and present at a conference as part of a research group in Sweden. And we went to present projects we did at the AA and the house, and then they said, oh, well, you're going to have to come to another conference and present another project. And we didn't have another project, so we thought, well, we'd make a proposal for the project at Chelsea, because this site was a very problematic site, or we felt it was very problematic. You can't see it so clearly here, but there's a slight camber in the middle. There's this very strange a patch of grass that doesn't seem to relate proportionately to the site in any way. It was very underused, and this idea of having this huge space right next to the Tate, central London, we thought it's a great opportunity, but somehow the students would put up structures, and it was a huge struggle for them, because financially, how do you make an impact on this site? As a gathering space, it felt very unfriendly, so we thought we'd tackle this site. They also told us that the design that had been put on this site was based on the gold section, which we thought was extraordinary because of the proportionality. Then it turned out that they'd taken the golden section off the buildings and just turned it into a motif, which was a pretty strange thing to do.
So I think we took exactly the same working methods from the AA to this site. And so first of all, we started to look into the social history of the site. And suddenly the social history of the site turned out to be quite complex and quite layered. And it started off as the site for Jeremy Bentham's Panopticon prison, which was never realized. Then it became the site of the Milbank Prison. Then it became a military hospital, and now it's a school. So suddenly, we have this progression from working with a social model which is based on isolation, then a social model which is based on working in unison, a sort of military model, then an art school which is based on the idea of kind of informal gathering and sociability. So we have very different strata of social organization that was suddenly present on this one particular site, and we decided to work with that. So this is the first layer. This is Jeremy Bentham's Panopticon prison, and we will talk about that in more detail later.
And
so the second, second layer.
So we looked at all these proposals, and so obviously this was one of the proposals we looked at. We looked at the use of the prison. So this is the total site. And we'll show you the section on which the Chelsea College overlays just a small, tiny bit of that site there. This was taken from a balloon. This is a very early photograph.
So this is the second layer of the site. It's the Milbank Prison, the largest prison at the time in the UK, a kind of super prison, which was experimenting with isolation cells. And the third layer, so here it is kind of missing at the minute. So although it vanished, it still is and was and is very much part of the site. So its absence is somehow felt, and it is still visible in the fabric of the city. So this was the third layer, the military ground.
This is them. Apparently, here they're doing stretcher practice. We couldn't find any images of them actually parading in the space, but apparently they did used to parade in the space. We met an old colonel. He said he organised a lot of the parading in the space, but this is stretcher practice. So we put this one in because we did look at some parades, and we did look at some formations of the parades, and particularly how the parades move around a square in this kind of aerial fashion like this. So we did observe this. And we also looked, at one point we were thinking of trying to make a project that translated to squares in different cities around the world, and so we started looking at the crosshairs, and we also we looked at various military maps and how you plotted a space. So we were trying to make something more general that we could move from place to place.
So this is an overlay that we created in order to be able to locate what we were looking for. So number 2 is the Tate, number 3 Chelsea College of Art, and the overlay figure that you see is the Milbank Prison with its retention wall all around. So you can see the sheer scale of this structure in the urban fabric. And when you look at the urban fabric, when the prison was demolished, a lot of the material from the prison then migrated to other places. So the brick was reused to build the Milbank estate.
Apparently it's the darker brick at the bottom.
So dark brick at the bottom. So materially the prison never left the site. It always remained there, and is still part of the fabric of the site. And you can also see in the site plan that the shape of the prison is still inscribed into the urban fabric.
And yes, so you can see this is the old moat around the prison, which is part of the estate. And the estate, this is opposite Chelsea, and this is where they're using to hang their washing. And these poles are meant to be apart from things from the prison as well. These stretcher poles.
So this is an overlay of the current Tate with the Milbank Prison, which is part of an excavation project, an archaeological project, where parts of the prison were excavated.
Yes. So the Tate is over the main entrance. So we were over the entrance to the left of the main entrance of the bit where we were dealing with.
Great. So the first layer, the imagined Panopticon. So from the physical traces of the real Milbank prison that we found on site, we also looked, and now also in the context of this seminar, studied more carefully Jeremy Bentham's plan for the Penitentiary Inspection House. And you might all be familiar with these particular plans, or with this particular plan, but we still wanted to take you through some aspects of that plan, because I think they become really relevant in how we deal with the project later on. So this is the physical structure. So we're looking at, again, a number of layers. So on the one hand, the physical structure of Jeremy Bentham's plan for the inspection house, then its influences, and then also the sort of dreams and utopias that were related to that. But if we start with the physical structure, first of all, it's a circular building. It's a radial or circular structure, and that's also one of the key characteristics, and Jeremy Bentham talks about that again and again. So the accommodation of the cells is in the perimeter or the circumference of the building, and we have centrally located the lodge of the inspector. And the space between the cells and the lodge is called the intermediate or the annular space. And this relationship somehow between the lodge and the cells, arranged in a circle, that sets out the key relationship that Bentham talks about. It sets out all the hierarchies. It sets out the relationship between the prisoner and the inspector, or between the observer and the observed. And all other moves that follow then are kind of based on that relationship or articulate that relationship further. And this relationship is a visual one. The inspector surveys the prisoner, and he surveys them at a distance. So it's not about physical interaction, it's about visibility and a visual relationship. It's also a one-to-one relationship because the prisoner is in isolation and everything is done that he cannot communicate with his fellow inmates. So for instance, the red walls that you see, the prison walls, or the partition walls of the cells, are being taken forward so that you couldn't look around the corner. The cells are then divided by these partitions. These partitions are actually extremely thin, and Jeremy Bentham also talks about the thinness of these walls because the kind of system of observation is so perfect that you don't need thick walls to contain somebody because you visually contain them and keep them in check. So the partitions are also set out radially so that the observer, the inspector at the center of the structure, would have the perfect view. And so Jeremy Bentham also talks about this idea of the perfect view that would be from the center of this structure. And the centrality in combination, it's a centrality that's really important for him, this idea of seeing everything, seeing without being seen. And for that, the circle, of course, is the most efficient shape. The inspector in the center hardly needs to move in order to observe everything. So he can look out for this entirety of the plan. He's got this panoramic view. And each deviation from the circle would actually obstruct that. So the circle is useful in that sense. The circle is also useful in terms of distance because the relationship between the inspector in the lodge and the prisoner is very direct. I have the shortest distance. And that short distance is really important for him. And so Jeremy Bentham explains that prisoners actually don't need to be chained because you can see every move on their face. And that means they weren't actually very far away. And if we look at this in terms of size, the lodge and the prisoner, the distance was only 4.5 meters. And we was really surprised by 13 feet only between the two participants. So it's not in the size of this room. So that would be the relationship that I would have with a prisoner. So the building was circular. The building was also very small, and the other thing that the circle offered was the maximum penetration of light. So it was actually a very transparent structure. He talked about this the circumference wall to have the maximum number of openings that light would penetrate deep into the structure, so that the cells would be completely illuminated, but the light would penetrate all the way to the lodge in the center. So meaning that it was a building of extreme transparency, and he later on talked about using materials other than stone in order to make it even more transparent. And in the night, that was then translated by using lamps which used reflectors. So it resulted in a very transparent and see-through and well-illuminated building. Right, so this is a section of the building where, on the one hand, the building was well lit, it was well illuminated. Bentham's idea was also that the building should be efficient in terms of health and cleanliness. The prison was well heated, it was well ventilated, it had sanitation, it had running water to every single cell. The cell sizes, and we looked at that, were 6 by 13 feet, which is 7 square meters. We compared that to European standards today. That's more than you have today in Europe, and it's double what you have currently in America. So the cells were relatively generous. There were about 48 inmates on one floor. One lodge could serve 2 floors. You can see that here in the section, that there were two floors of prisoners and one lodge in the center. So this relationship could then be repeated, so you could simply stack them up. So he drew different variations of this particular idea. Some of them had, for instance, a central lantern, which would bring additional light to the center of the building.
So when we first started working on the site at Chelsea, and we worked with the Milbank Prison, many people made the mistake of calling the Milbank Prison the Panopticon. It was widely referred to as the Panopticon. And it was also, and like many people probably, the first thing you read when you read about the Panopticon is Foucault. And so we read Foucault, and that was our experience. And so because we were involved in this seminar and we thought we should look into these things a bit more deeply, so we looked at different perspectives on this. So we looked at Janet Semple's book and the article "Defence of the Panopticon," and so and looking at what she was saying about it. It seems, well, from my understanding, that it seems to be her primary. I'll read a few notes that I've written about this. So the primary difference between Bentham and Foucault is that Foucault lacks a moral position. He saw power as evil and did not recognise or consider the quality of life or the aesthetics of existence, i.e., the good. Consequently, Foucault he has very different interpretations of a reformer's motives. So he will always be looking for the ill in the reformer's motives. So in Bentham's motives. So, for example, he considers that he's being deceived, or the reformer is masking their true intentions. So Bentham made many problematic statements, which, if you do take them, you could see how they would support Foucault's thinking. But she argues that Foucault didn't, when he was talking about the Panopticon, he didn't consider it in light, especially of Bentham's later writings, and this is what he should have taken into account. That Bentham, in fact, wanted to create a humane prison, and he had this slogan, lenity, severity and economy, and that a primary correction to Foucault's perspective would be, although Foucault did acknowledge this to some extent, would be that Bentham insisted that his prison must be accessible, as all public establishments should be, to the great open committee of the tribunal of the world. And this would this would kind of control the power of the governor, if you like, or the inspector in the centre of the prison. Bentham considered that democracy itself was fragile and needed to be upheld by the light of freedom of information and discussion. So one of Bentham's primary thoughts about criminals, which is why he felt they needed to be inspected, was he compared them to be like children. And he considered that criminals were work in progress, and the problem was that it was with drink and idleness. And there's a quote that criminals, like other men, were potentially rational beings responsible for their own actions. His central belief was that the mechanism of human morality could be refashioned, the criminal mind literally reformed by sobriety and work.
So Bentham didn't only consider the interior of the prison, but he also made plans for a possible exterior. So he had a number of sketches that looked at what external spaces could look like, how gardens could be integrated, or work yards. And again, he came back to this idea that that could happen in a circular shape, but it could also happen in a square plan. And how how basically the idea of the prison could grow. What is interesting Bentham's Panopticon was never built, and it was still highly influential. So if you look at prison architecture at the time, he had a tremendous impact. So this is a plan, for instance, by the French architect Guillaume Abel Blouet, who was also a reformer in his country and was looking at how to redefine prison design. And of course, he takes Bentham's plan and takes that further. He also takes the idea of the square surrounding yard. So like Bentham, Blouet also believed in using architecture to realize sort of social reform and in how far the prison could be a reformatory institution through work and education. And this is a plan that, again, Foucault refers to. Bentham also had an influence on prisons that were built. There are a number of built examples that would relate to his plans and, let's say, with modifications. And there are perhaps a number to be mentioned. The Presidio Modelo, which is called Model Prison in Cuba, which was built in 1926 and ran until the 60s. It has a similar circular shape. It has a lantern in the center. It has the transparency of the cell. This is a photograph of the prison from 1926. It had the central watchtower. Here, 5 floors of inmates being watched by one single watchtower. The capacity was about 465 inmates, but that was often exceeded. Another prison that had a similar setup is Arnhem in the Netherlands, which is one of 3 of that style in the Netherlands, built for solitary confinement with a central watchtower. What's interesting about this one, so it's a similar size, it's 56 meter in diameter, so slightly bigger than Bentham, but same number of cells on the circumference. And what's interesting about this one is that it became incredibly popular with the inmates. Because prison rules were relaxed, and at some point the prisoners were allowed to actually wander around in the central yard. They were playing football and other games. The watchtower was then converted into the guards' canteen, so suddenly who was watching whom was being reversed. So it became quite an iconic prison, which ran into the 2000s, I think. And OMA, Rem Koolhaas, but Office of Metropolitan Architecture, actually did a scheme in the 80s to transform this prison, which was already operating as almost like a public space with work, life, meetings. And so he took that further with 2 streets which were sunken into the yard, taking away the kind of the eye of the Panopticon and sinking it down in order to create other communal and entertainment spaces for the prisoners. Unfortunately, also that was never implemented. The last prison of that type of category is the Stateville Penitentiary in Illinois, which was built in 1919 and ran until 2015. So again, a very long lifespan. It's a high-security prison with a central watchtower which is armed and 4 stories of cells. This was famously photographed by Andreas Gursky in 2002. There's also a photograph of this specific prison in Foucault's Discipline and Punish, and as I said, only got closed in 2015. So Bentham believed that the Panopticon principle was not only beneficial for the design of prisons and considered it for a variety of institutions for which surveillance was somehow important. So he considered it he had a rural panopticon, he considered it for schools, for hospitals, for workhouses. Here a plan of his brother Samuel for a house of industry. There was also an art school that they were considering in St. Petersburg. And vice versa, buildings, let's say industrial buildings, considered Bentham's ideas as an interesting form of plan. This is the North Mill in Belper by architect William Strutt, who also got inspired by the idea of this sort of let's say, well inspected and efficient way of working.
1811, was that pre-Bentham?
1811, yeah, it's a little bit late. So the plans were 1791. So
Yeah.
Yep.
So we also looked at other things that have influenced Bentham on how he arose at his design. So he was one of his sayings were he described his wish for the Panopticon. He said, "It will be a lantern, a thing of beauty, a glass beehive." So Foucault described the Panopticon as a cruel, ingenious cage, a pitiless contraption designed for control and subjugation. But Bentham's vision was of a beautiful building, a stately pleasure dome, comparable, he said, to the rotundas of Ranelagh and Dublin and the Circus of Bath. So this is Ranelagh, which is in Chelsea. It was in Chelsea. This is Canaletto's painting of the interior of this building.
And this is the plan. So you see a lot of similarity. Again, it says the building is circular. It has a central lodge. It has an extreme transparency. You can actually look through the structure. The division of the walls is radial. So there are a lot of kind of structural similarities. So this was actually before Bentham's, and we were speculating in how Bentham might have visited this structure.
And then there's this building in Dublin, which he could have visited as well. This was the Rotonda Hospital, Dublin Rotonda Hospital. So the architect was Richard Cassels. This was 1748. This is the interior. So when Bentham when you look at this in the light of how his building is normally discussed, he was actually considering using the very latest materials. So he was considering using cast iron, which he was going to use for the pillars and the arches and the staircases. And 12 years previous to this, there'd been the first iron bridge at Coalbrookdale, so this was fairly new. He was also thinking of using glass, and they recently worked out manufacturing techniques for doing glass on a larger scale. He wanted plaster floors instead of wood because he thought that would be more hygienic and fireproof. As Janet Semple, she postulates that really the Panopticon was closer to foreshadowing Paxton's Crystal Palace than it was to Pentonville. So a surprising comment in the light of this series was that we found out that Bentham liked reading novels, and this is I don't know, I won't pronounce it correctly, but this Fenelon's Telemachus was apparently was the inspiration for utilitarianism, and the heroine in this story had a glass palace, and Bentham considered this was the archetype for the Panopticon. So next image. So this is partly why this looks so pink and pretty, I think. Anyway. So if you didn't know, The Adventures of Telemachus was a French novel, and it was originally published in 1699, and then it was republished 20 years later. It's a slender plot, and it's described as filling a gap in Homer's Odyssey, recounting the educational travels of Telemachus, son of Ulysses. Anyway. Then, so another aspect of Bentham was that he made all these private notes and he had secret visions for the Panopticon. And so there's an argument that he was actually influenced by utopian ideas. So the point that she makes is he was a man with a vision that had its origins in the English utopian tradition and in the Arcadian romance of the pastoral idyll. The Panopticon was an enclave of reason, isolated from the temptations and disorders of the ordinary world. So Bentham said he disliked, he wasn't a utopian, and he particularly disliked Thomas More. But there was a lot of similarities between Thomas More's ideas and what Bentham, the ideas that Bentham came up with. Thomas More's capital was called, fictitious capital was called Armorotum, probably pronounced incorrectly, but the idea was it was built on a gentle slope of a tidal river, not unlike the Thames. It had piped water, spacious housing, gardens, piped music at meal times, but there was a strong emphasis on labour that Bentham would have approved of. So the idea that as in this utopia, as in the Panopticon, idleness was the worst sin. So we're going to show this image here because this one image has got boats on, and we like the fact that there's boats on this image because a lot of Bentham's ideas... Show the next slide. This is his nephew, so this is his brother Samuel. A lot of his brothers and sisters died, but his brother Samuel survived. And his brother Samuel's son, George, who became a very prominent botanist. And he published books on the classification of plants. They were plants named after him. And he travelled the world. And this was one Bentham's original aim before he did all this work that he did do on philosophy. And he was originally wanted to be a botanist himself. But he decided, due to ill health and the fact that he had all these other ambitions, he put it to one side. But he kept a very keen interest on this idea of botany and discovering new plants. So in these secret ideas or these private thoughts and ambitions for the Panopticon, he talks about it being a place for collecting plants. He talks about sending trading explorer expeditions from the Panopticon. He even advertises this for a physician at one point, and he says it would be useful if they have an interest in plants, and he's going to have Panopticon nurseries in which he's going to propagate the seeds he brings back from his voyages. And there's extensive commentary about the fact that he had these plans for a Panopticon town, and that he was going to build houses in the walls of the building and he was going to have covered walkways to the river, and he was going to have a tavern with a terrace where he could have firework displays, and he was generally going to have build this whole infrastructure around the prison. There was other sort of fascinating ideas, like the fact that he was going to have shops and buildings which would have balconies outside, which would become like aerial gardens and aerial walkways that all join up together. So he had all these fantastical ideas for how he would like this to be developed. So somebody he did acknowledge influencing him, or he certainly acknowledged that he really liked the ideas, was Francis Bacon. And he also he had this proposed, his fictional utopia was New Atlantis. And one of the reasons he approved of Francis Bacon was that he integrated lots of ideas around science and how science could benefit society. So there was he wanted to breed silkworms and beads and cure diseases and invent flying machines and submarines. And he had all these ideas about harnessing and reflecting light. And so there was he had a lot of sympathy and empathy with Francis Bacon.
Right. And then the real Milbank prison happened. So after a number of obstacles, the plan for Jeremy Bentham's Panopticon were abandoned, and in 1812 a new competition was announced to find the architect for the real Milbank prison. There were numerous architects involved. The original design is by William Williams. It was then developed further by Thomas Hardwick. Thomas Hardwick was then replaced by John Harvey. Harvey was replaced by Robert Smirke, who finally finished the building. So already when planning the building, there were lots of problems. It was a troublesome project from the start. It was built on swampy and unstable ground. It was over budget. It was difficult to find a system of foundations, which Robert Smirke, the last architect, finally worked out. And in 1816, the Milbank Penitentiary finally opened. It was the largest prison in Britain at the time, and experimented with the idea of isolation cells. So we're now back in Milbank, we're back at the real site, the site where we were going to do an intervention. So the Milbank prison is often confused to be a panopticon structure. It actually doesn't quite work like that. William Williams owed little to the idea of the panopticon, except that he placed a chapel in the center, and the guards' quarters are surrounding that. The prison was set out as a series of hexagonal shapes or petals, and or petal-shaped wings, each of them 3 stories with a central watchtower. Each of these petals was divided in 5 courtyards. And as I said, the structure didn't really work as a panopticon. It didn't have the clarity, it didn't have the sort of structure. And Jane Semple describes as a labyrinth of a building with full of dark corridors and passages and winding staircases and innumerable doors and gates. So confusing it was that wardens would place their trails with chalk marks on the walls. So it was labyrinthine. It was in many ways exactly the opposite of what Jeremy Bentham imagined. It was vast, it was labyrinthine, it was dark, it was unhygienic, it had poor sanitation, it had lack of ventilation. So this is a photograph of one of the petal-shaped wings with a central watchtower. So you can see it's a kind of fortress-like structure, a massive structure, very small windows, an enormous distance between the watchtower. One wonders how that actually worked as a watchtower. Distance between the watchtower and the cells without an immediate access, which Bentham would have wanted between the tower and the cell. It was full of visual obstructions. The ventilation system was so bad it would carry a lot of sounds. Prisoners would actually communicate with each other, although in isolation. And when you look at the ground plan of the prison, so the chapel was located in the center. Then the governor's quarters and the laundries and offices were the next ring. Then you had the 6 petal-shaped wings with the 5 courtyards each and the central watchtower. So it was in many ways the exact opposite to the Bentham design. The surveillance that he imagined couldn't really happen here. From the tower you could see into the cell, but for instance the corridor was on the outside of the building, so it was not possible to actually watch the wardens that would actually interact with the prisoners, which is something that he actually talked about in great detail, in how far the inspector was also able to inspect the wardens interacting with the prisoners. And so the prison was riddled with diseases due to the lack of sanitation. There was many outbreaks of horrible diseases, and the prisoners only had 5 minutes of exercise a day. So it was a problem. We looked at comparing the size between Bentham's Panopticon and the Milbank prison. So you understand the vastness of this structure and the efficiency of his system. So Bentham could have accommodated the same amount of prisoners on a much, much smaller site. So there is an incredible inefficiency in this.
They didn't
structure.
want to go back there.
So again, she writes, if the ground plan of the building at Milbank is a geometric puzzle, the interior is assuredly an eccentric maze, long, dark and narrow corridors and twisting passages in which the visitor, unaccustomed to the dubious twilight, has to feel his way, double-locked doors opening in all sorts of queer angles and leading sometimes into blind entries and frequently to stone staircases so steep and narrow so steep and narrow are not unlike the devious steps by which the traveller reaches the towers of Strasbourg or some other cathedrals, except that they're even more gloomy. So this is a tower in Strasbourg Cathedral, and the newspaper which published this article was saying, so the Milbank prison staircases are much worse. So the prison basically failed. It basically was degraded to be no longer fit to actually hold any inmates, and soon after it was closed down. So in 1892 it was already closed down, and the site started to be redeveloped.
So it was a combination of the fact that the environment was so unhealthy, and apparently the rules and regulations were so lax in the prison. There was a mutiny, and they were partly the diets were deteriorated because the population was very cross with the way the prisoners had been treated so well previously, and they thought they'd had such a soft regime. So there was a major epidemic, and they had to evacuate all the prisoners to hulks, and then after that it just became a depot for convicts.
Mm-hmm. So architectural undeterminism or pleasure. So in his work on the Panopticon, Bentham uses architecture as a device to control and organize human behavior and discipline. So architecture or the physical structure of the building is used to forge certain relationships and to cement certain structures or hierarchies or orders. So architecture becomes an important tool in the process of establishing that order and executing discipline. So in a sense, pain in Bentham's Panopticon is inflicted not through maltreatment or hunger or cold or disease like it would be in Milbank, but it was actually done through architecture. The prison was actually well lit, it was heated, it was clean. So it was not even the physical structure, it was not the thickness of the wall. And Bentham even writes, the thickest walls have been found occasionally unavailing, but upon this plan the thinnest wall would be most sufficient. So in Bentham's Panopticon, it's through architectural means that these relationships are established. And so Bentham uses architecture as a very important tool to establish this order and also his idea of reform. So, pleasure. So, we are saying basically human beings, on the other hand, are incredibly resistant to architecture's power to control them. They have an incredible imagination and are generally very skeptical to functional or social determinism. And in fact, there's something really pleasurable in misusing, in using architecture in ways that are perhaps not meant to be, or that are not part of their original purpose. So there's a creative or an active moment in this appropriation. And during the work that we've done on the different structures that we worked on, we've been referring back a lot to Herman Hertzberger, his Dutch architect, and who spent his life collecting and creating moments where this spontaneous interpretation of an architecture in pursuit of pleasure or empowerment is really important. And he's arguing that architecture has to be more open-ended, and he pleads for to make spaces that are more receptive for, let's say, unexpected uses or forms of interpretation or appropriation. And so this is back to what we've been trying to do. And so Herman Hertzberger says, if something is geared very specifically to a certain function or the way it has programmed to function, i.e. to what it is expected to function, this is the sort of functionalism that functionalists are talking about. But this is also the minimum of utility that can be expected of architecture. In order to achieve more than the minimum in the diversity of situations as they arise, I plead to form space with a greater accommodating potential, like a musical instrument that sounds the way the player wants it to sound. The point is to increase this accommodating potential and thus to make space more receptive to different situations. And once you start looking for them, it is easy to even find them in the most unexpected corners and examples of use that designers, if any, certainly never envisaged.
So with this we found that people would sit on here and put a coffee on here. At the opening, we won't show you a picture of the opening because it's too confusing because so many people can't see the structure. But people were sitting here and people were walking in front of the other people. So there were lots of ways of uses and ways that people could actually invent their own use, which is what we're saying really.
Mm-hmm. And so we were looking for structures that somehow can be interpreted, that can be appropriated, where use is not predetermined, but use is something that is being imagined
and creative.
And is creative. Pentagon Petal. So this is the intervention that we proposed for the parade route, or the
Stein Hopkins.
Sorry.
You can tell they sponsored it. That's why it's called that. Yeah. So initially we struggled incredibly with this green space in the middle, which was so unattractive, and that we were going to plant a garden there, and we know a lot about gardening now, and we know a lot about how much it costs to plant a garden there. But so we struggled with this for a long time until we decided that actually we could actually deal with the grass. And we've been talking about how it's interesting that all the inspection tower and all the central area that's so important in this prison, we've actually removed from this area. So we've made it like an open space. So in a way, we've done the reverse to how a lot of prisons are conducted. But here we've actually, from the Milbank Prison, we've kept the cells around the edges, and we've kept the kitchens, and we've taken the observation towers out.
So for anybody who hasn't been there, so this intervention reinterpreted the floor plan of the Milbank Prison into a flower-shaped bench. And so this interpretation suddenly changed the social organization of the prison to a very different kind of social environment. And that was the shift that we were trying to make with this project. And so we went through a number of steps. So the first step was we looked at the original prison plan of Milbank. And so you see that at the top of these diagrams. And then we started to remove everything from the plan that was relating to control. So we started to remove the watchtowers. We started to remove anything, the guards' quarters. So we took everything away that was relating to control. And what was left were the cells and the kitchens. And that's the bottom diagram. Then the next step was we scaled this figure down. And so by scaling it, so on the left-hand side, you see the figure of Milbank Prison, and on the right-hand side, you see our bench. So basically, you have the same kind of geometric figure, but a very different social use. And And so the next move was to put it back on site and find a location where it could fit. So by kind of re-editing, by basically re-editing and scaling it, we were suddenly producing a very different object and very different ways of interacting with this object. So the bench is 120 meter long. It can accommodate up to 300 people, which is the same amount of people as the first generation of prisoners in Milbank, which could all sit on this enormous bench. Or it's the same amount of people that he would have in a 6-story Panopticon. And then we're saying, so why a bench? So it was detailed like a garden bench. And so why were we thinking of a bench? So first of all, we were thinking about the dimensions. We wanted the dimensions to be quite ambiguous. So we looked at the width of a bed in the cell, and we looked at the dimensions of a garden bench, and we arrived at something that could be interpreted as either a bed or a bench. We were also looking at the bench because the bench is a very unassuming object. It's an object you usually share. You don't have a problem sitting next to somebody on a bench. Sitting is also a way of kind of taking hold of a site, of appropriating a site, which we thought was interesting. And the other thing is that benches are something really problematic in the urban environment because they produce loitering, which is something that is actually not desired. So when you look at bench design, generally it is an anti-use design. It is a sort of panopticon-like design. You shouldn't do this, you shouldn't do that. You cannot sleep on this, you cannot do this. So we wanted this to be a very generous bench. So the generosity of the bench was an important aspect for us. So as you said, the dimensions were kept deliberately kind of ambiguous, so you could see it as a platform, and we related to the idea of the pier, for instance, or you could use it as a bench. There were different opportunities for how to sit, so as a sort of one-to-one, to have a conversation, or to sit in different configurations. So each of these pentagons, which in the prison were meant for isolation and solitary confinement, were now reinterpreted as sort of together groups of people and for informal gatherings of students, of staff, of tourists. And it was the corners that became specifically productive, where people would usually sit in the corners, or they would sit on the edges, and they would have picnics on it. They would sit next to each other or opposite each other.
So this was a group of local youngsters who used to congregate every night on one of these V-shapes around our bench, and they moved around which ones so they would party every night on one of these sections. This is the photograph that we should send to the Arts Council, I was thinking, trying to get funding, but they used to occupy these areas and became their sort of hangout spot. And this was a staff party. What I thought was really funny about this was they all decided that this was the dancing room. No one said that this should be the dancing room. It just became the dancing room. And I was watching this from above, and people would be leaping across these benches. So you thought health and safety disaster, but they were just leaping across. But it was just quite funny the way they selected this for themselves.
So the project brought together the kind of disparate communities that are sort of linked to this site, so the community of the college, students, the staff, but also the tourists that were passing by on their way to the Tate, but also local communities that were kind of living nearby. So it became...
Walk their dog on it.
So it suddenly became a possibility to gather people together in a really informal way, in a way that was not forced. And brought together people that were linked quite loosely to the site, and I'm still amazed how many people come and say, "I actually sat on this bench," and still remember that as a special moment on the journey from one place to another. So the installation tried to also make sense of a very barren urban space, which was very large, that 2,000 square meters, and by somehow shrinking that into this confined space. And we were talking a lot about in how far it should be open or not, and how far it should actually be a barrier. It was a barrier in the site, but in that sense it was quite a productive one.
So we just felt that just by giving this edge to this across the grass, suddenly the grass became usable, and they suddenly felt from being a really negative space, it became, just by giving people a back, and we were saying it's almost like an arena, like a small arena within the bigger useless arena. That somehow makes the whole thing more appealing.
So this is another one of our scale comparison. This is Bentham's prison in relation to Pentagon Petal. So you can imagine the intimacy of the Bentham Panopticon. It was we were really surprised by that when we made these comparisons. It was quite an intimate building, and somehow Pentagon Petal is kind of tracing out that intimate building, which would have easily fitted onto the site in Chelsea.
This is Malcolm's photo. But, but one of the things we thought was also quite interesting in terms of observation. This could be seen from all the windows round the edge. So that it was like there was a light. It was like the observation has shifted to the studios around the side as well, which was very interesting. And the fact that everyone knows this image, everybody in this area knows this image. They know what it is. And so it's like in the cultural memory. So you don't even have to explain to people what it is. They just know it. Everyone recognises it, which is very interesting.
So perhaps we could read this. I think what we were trying to do is we were trying to somehow link to the Bentham spirit, to bring some clarity and some utility to this place. We were looking not at architectural determinism, so we were not looking at social levelling, but rather to challenge sort of fixed hierarchies and produce a sort of dynamic and perhaps democratic type of space that preserves life, or rather the breadth of aliveness in this space. So the bench was installed from July 4th to August the 14th, 2016. After that period, we had to disassemble it, which was very sad, into 24 individual units, which were now donated to a garden project in Camberwell. And therefore having a second life in another iteration. And that's it.